Thanks for tuning in to Mystic Witch. I'm your host, Blue. You can find out more about me at bluejunetarot.com. Mystic Witch is a podcast about magic, divination, and all things supernatural. Hey, Mystic Witches! Today our guest is witch, professional psychic, and teacher, Mat Auryn. He is a high priest in the Sacred Fires tradition of witchcraft and holds initiations, degrees, and training in other traditions of witchcraft, occultism, and mysticism. He is the author of the newly released Psychic Witch, a metaphysical guide to meditation, magic, and manifestation published by Llewellyn. He is mostly known for his popular blog on Patheos Pagan entitled For Puck's Sake, as well as having columns in Horns Magazine, Witches and Pagans magazine, The Witch's Almanac, Modern Witch, and many others. Today we're going to be talking about what it means to be a psychic witch. Welcome, Mat. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on.
I'm so excited to have you. This is going to be fun. So I guess let's start just by you telling us a little bit about what the essence of the book is.
Okay. So this is the book that I always wanted growing up and exploring these realms. So the book starts with figuring out what psychic ability is and what your natural predisposition is. So just as we know with traditional teaching, different people are predisposed to different senses, and that informs their learning style. So we have visual learners, we have kinesthetic learners, we have auditory learners, and that's the same with psychic ability. We're naturally predispositioned to a certain aspect of psychic ability. So the book explores that, and it strengthens the clairs that you may be a little bit less predisposed to, or that may be a little bit more dormant. And it's sort of a masterclass in developing your psychic ability safely. And then it gets into sort of the basics of magic and what magic is, and how psychic ability can help your magic, and reverse engineering that to do magic on the spot without anything.
Yes. So just for anyone who doesn't know, can you explain what the clairs are? I think a lot of people just aren't that familiar with that term.
Sure. So clair it comes from the French word clear. So the clairs are what is normally called extrasensory perception, which is the idea of our senses extended. So, for example, vision becomes clairvoyance, hearing becomes clairaudience, the sensation of touch becomes clairtangency, taste is clairgustance, smell is clairalience. So I actually don't like the word extrasensory perception, even though I do use it in the book, because it sort of denotes that these are senses that are extended beyond our primary senses, and I actually think it's the other way around. I think our clair senses are natural, our primary senses. When you think about us as spiritual entities, right? Being incarnated in a physical body is the shortest amount of time that we have. But we have senses as spirits before we're incarnated and after we're incarnated. So I see the physical senses as actually being extensions of that, as the crystallization of those senses when we're incarnated in body.
I could not agree with you more. It's sort of like how we say supernatural, but it's really the most natural thing in the world.
Exactly. I hate the word supernatural being used with magic. It's a pet peeve.
I get it. So who actually is capable of working magic, and what does it mean? Who is psychic?
So my answer is everyone. So we all have a soul, and as such, we all have psychic ability. We are sort of conditioned to lose that psychic ability. I discuss children in my book, and as many people who have been around children or have children or remember their childhood, children are extra psychic and extra magical. And then we're quickly taught to dismiss that. It's actually interesting because in part of the book, I explore studies behind the brainwave states that children are in and when that shifts. So children up until I believe it's the age of 7 are primarily in the alpha brainwave state, which is the brainwave state that is connected to psychic ability. And then once they're about that certain age, when they start understanding what's expected of them from other people, like parents, they start losing that state, and they start entering into beta. And beta is our normal everyday thinking consciousness. So it's interesting because that also ties into children and imagination. We know children are super imaginative, super magical, and a lot of that has to deal with imagination. And imagination is in that alpha brainwave state. It's the same brainwave state as psychic ability. So as they start learning, to dismiss their imagination, they start losing those senses. Likewise, since I see psychic ability as the perception of energy, we all can naturally perceive it, and therefore we can also manipulate it. And that's how I define magic, as manipulating energy consciously and with your will.
So what's the difference between intuition and psychic ability?
That is a fantastic question. So I differentiate the two. I follow, in all of my witchcraft training, we have a 3-soul model. So that's higher self, lower self, and middle self. The middle self is our thinking mind. It's our rational mind. It's our ego. And by ego, I mean our sense of self, our sense of identity. The lower self is our childlike, animalistic. It's the body, it's the senses, it's emotion. And then the higher self is that aspect of us that is divine. It's when people talk about the soul, or that essence that is eternal, that is the higher self. So intuition is a conversation between the lower self to the middle self. So intuition is usually felt in the body as physical sensations, like a gut feeling. It's also perceived as emotions, or just kind of having a feeling or a hunch about something. And in many traditions of witchcraft, so let's take the Victor Anderson fairy tradition. The name that they have for the lower self is the sticky one, because it's this idea of constantly absorbing things in its environment. So people who say that they're empaths are really in tune with their lower self. So intuition is that animal instinct, that animal nature that is assessing information constantly in our environment that we aren't consciously processing. So that's intuition. Psychic ability, on the other hand, is the higher self speaking to the middle self. So these are things that have nothing to do with our external environment. This is where names and dates and information that has nothing to do with external stimulus comes in. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think I definitely have a really firm grasp on it because I have clairaudience, so I understand what you mean about something coming from the external and something coming from the internal. But I think people are still going to have some struggles, especially since they are so often categorized together, intuition and psychic abilities.
Right.
But yeah, hopefully people can get a better sense of that through reading your book, because you really elaborate. That's like really kind of a big part of what your book's about, right?
Yeah, so I believe all psychic senses are internal and external, but I still feel that that's a higher self conversation. So I don't know, have you ever seen the show Sherlock on BBC?
I haven't.
Okay, so in the show, Sherlock is sort of this like savant genius, and he can make these like wild assessments just by picking up on things that people don't normally pick up on. Like there's a scuff on their shoe, so this means that, they write with this hand. Those are things that we're constantly picking up, but not consciously processing. And that information is what I call intuition.
Oh, okay. So I just call that perception. And I agree with you that is where our intuition comes from. We don't even realize that we're noticing certain body language and that's a big part of my work. I'm sure you can relate as a reader. Listening to how someone says something, they almost know the answer a lot of the time by the way they word the question, right?
Right, right. And intuition, like I said, usually it comes as a feeling, a hunch, or a physical sensation. And those are all lower self type things. Intuition and psychic ability do weave in and out of each other. But in my book, I try to really focus on building that connection with your lower self and your higher self and your middle self to change your perspective when it comes to psychic information or magical ability. So the metaphor that I use in the book, it's sort of like your middle self is reading glasses, your higher self is a telescope, and your lower self is a microscope. So all three give you different vantage points when it comes to psychic ability, and often switching between them can give you more information.
I love that metaphor. It's so good.
So how can psychic ability assist you with your magic?
Oh, good one. So in the book, I start by talking about a couple of my struggles along this path. Before I went through any vigorous training with any tradition, I started with magic before psychic ability. And I would, cast these spells. I would do everything in the book. I'd go through the motions. I would say the words. I would get the ingredients. And maybe 25% of them worked, but a lot of them fell short of manifesting anything. When I went through my formal training, what's interesting is every tradition I've trained under, we spend at least a year in psychic development before we even touch magic, because magic is the manipulation of energy. So psychic ability can be used to enhance the magic. So, for example, projecting those senses, instead of receiving them, we project it onto our magic and it enhances it. It also, a lot of times people are working in faith. So I reference Ivo Dominguez Jr.'s work, which is brilliant. And he talks about the noirs. And the noirs are the opposite of the clairs. Noir is French for dark. So it's this idea of being able to manipulate energy, but not being able to perceive it. But magic is so much stronger when we can perceive it and we know if we're doing it right. So, for example, I can usually tell if a circle has been properly cast because with my psychic development, I have a clairaudient experience when the circle is cast, where it's very much like tinnitus, and then it goes away as soon as the circle is released. So being able to perceive that energy can make sure that you're doing it more effectively, and it can enhance that magic so much stronger.
Wow. You mentioned that people sometimes or oftentimes operate with magic under faith. How important do you think faith is when you're working spells?
So I actually don't like the word faith because faith usually gives this sort of idea of blind faith.
Yeah.
And as witches, I don't think we should have blind faith. I believe that we should be more like scientists. We should experiment with ideas, hold them as true for the purposes of experimentation, record them, and see what works and what doesn't work. I like the word will more than like intent or belief. Because belief still signifies this kind of idea that, you aren't sure if it's going to happen or if it's going to manifest, whereas will, you're willing it. And intention, you can have good intentions. I can intend to cross the street all day, but until I will myself to do it, it's not going to happen.
That's true. Okay, so let's talk about whether or not we need to buy the tools, the crystals, the herbs, the candles. Do we need those things to practice magic?
So I don't believe we need those things. So, being a witch, I love all of that stuff. I love my crystals and I love my candles and I love the traditional spell work. But I find, and I found this in my own experience, as a child, exploring witchcraft up till now, where I thought I needed all of these things to cast magic. And, it ends up being expensive, and it can limit us from actually performing the magic until we get the things. And it can also get us in the trap of spiritual materialism, where we believe that the things are what have the magic. So, for example, I'm an animist, so I do believe that everything does have its own essence, its own energy, its own soul. But unless you can work magic, or energy work, unless you can perceive things, you can't really intermingle with that energy. You can't really awaken that energy. You can't really connect it to the level that would be more potent for magic. I believe that witchcraft is sort of its own living entity in a way, and I think that it has a glamour about it. And we see this with the witch aesthetic, which is really, really popular, and I love it. I love that witchy aesthetic. But it's a glamour. I believe that witchcraft does this every now and then as a living entity where it's drawing people in. And some people will get hung up on the materialism. Some people will get tired of it and explore other things. But then there will be the few people that stay with it and dive deeper.
Dive deeper into the aesthetic?
Dive deeper into the witchcraft, into the magic, into the deeper mysteries of...
and let's be honest, that really just entails reading a lot of books. So
it does involve reading. It also involves doing. And sure. Genuinely wanting to connect. I think one of the biggest pitfalls is losing what they call in yoga that beginner's mind. The idea of entering as someone who doesn't have all the answers, entering as someone who has that sort of full card energy of, being eager to learn and eager to experience. I think that the mysteries, what we refer to in witchcraft as the mysteries, start revealing themselves to the people who are earnest in their craft.
Truth. So tell us a little bit about your path, some of your training, and what led you to writing this book.
So I was raised in a very religious household as a child. We were a hybrid of Pentecostal and evangelical, which is like the most extreme you can get in Christianity. Whoa. Yeah, so I wasn't exposed to a lot. And I think it was around like 7 or 8 years old. I happened to watch the movie The Craft. And, a lot of people scoff at that. A lot of witches, like, oh, people watch The Craft and they think that they're witches. But for me, it was almost like this religious experience because although it is a Hollywood movie, it did portray witchcraft as something people could do. And this is something I wasn't exposed to. And it just sort of ignited the spark. So I spent, a lot of my childhood trying to find more information on witchcraft, with my misconceptions based on the movie. And I remember my elementary school library. I started looking for any book that had to deal with witchcraft or ghosts or anything like that, which doesn't yield a lot of results in an elementary school library. You're right, because you get like Roald Dahl's The Witches and stuff like that.
Which is a great book.
Yeah, no, totally. All of his works are great. But I struck gold one day. I found one of those Time Life series that they used to do on like the unexplained and the supernatural, and there was one on witches. So I started going through it, and it has the stuff you would sort of expect. It has like all the historical witchcraft, all the folklore witchcraft, and then in the very back it had a small section on modern day witchcraft, well, at least for its time. And so you have like Anton LaVey, of course. They always put Anton LaVey in it. And then they had one picture of Maxine Sanders and Alex Sanders, the founders of the Alexandrian tradition of witchcraft. And they had the word Wicca. So as a child, I was armed with a word. So I went to the computer lab where they were just starting to integrate computers into the schools. And I would get on Netscape Navigator and I would, pull up all these different angel fire sites. And I started learning a little bit more. And I went to my local bookstore and I kept trying to buy books and they wouldn't let me buy books. They said I needed a guardian with me for the Wicca books. So I eventually got my hands on Silver Ravenwolf, and I devoured the Silver Ravenwolf. I love her. I still love her to this day.
Same. I just recommended one of her books yesterday. What book was it?
It was actually Teen Witch, which was perfect marketing because the cover was supposed to look like The Craft, right?
Yes.
So, like, for me, I was like, So, and to sidetrack for a moment, my next book, which I'm not talking much about, that's contracted already. I'm kind of keeping it mum's the word. I think I'm more excited that Silver Ravenwolf is writing the foreword for it than the actual book.
Oh, wow. How things come full circle.
Yeah. So in my, even in my dedication of my book, I dedicate it to my 4 strongest influences on my path. And I start with Silver Ravenwolf because that was my first. And I talk about how I would devour her books and I would, write in my journals, like my little child book of shadows, copying her information. And I dreamed of one day having my own book with that little crescent moon logo on it. And now I do. So anyways, long story short, so I slowly immersed myself into witchcraft, and then I kind of ventured away from it for a little bit. I started exploring other avenues like yoga and shamanism and new age modalities. And then I had an experience, and I couldn't find information on it. And I finally found this experience in one of Christopher Penzak's books. And I was reading it one day, and my boyfriend at the time, because I just had moved to New England, I'm reading it, and he's like, oh, yeah, Christopher Penzak, he lives, like, really close to here. So I looked him up, and he runs the Temple of Witchcraft tradition. So I looked them up. They had an open house. I went to that. I fell in love with the work that they do. So I signed up to train with them. And then I decided to go back and learn from his teacher, his original teacher, who's Laurie Cabot. And from there, I met Devin Hunter. And Devin Hunter and I had these amazing long conversations, and I had never met anyone who saw witchcraft the way that I saw witchcraft. So I decided to study under him and his tradition, and that's the Sacred Fires tradition, which I am a high priest in now. So those are my main traditions I trained in. But just being involved in the witchcraft community and knowing a lot of witches and clients and students, I find that just because you're a witch, you're not necessarily psychic. And just because you're psychic, it doesn't mean you can really manifest things in your life. And through my studies, I realized that psychic ability and magic are 2 sides of the same coin, and that you can use psychic ability to develop your magic, and you can use magic to develop your psychic ability. So I wanted to write the book that I had always wanted. And not to sound cocky, a lot of it came from my frustration with books on psychic ability on the market.
Mm-hmm. There is a lot to be desired out there, and a lot of things that, as you said, when you had your own experience, you went searching for material and probably came up empty-handed in a lot of ways. And I've been there. I think a lot of people have. So I'm very excited to see what your book has. I'm like really, really excited to read it. I'm super stoked. Is it out? It's out now, right?
So the actual release date, the official release date is February 8th, but people are already receiving their copies.
Nice.
So yeah, so that's exciting. It's exciting to see people posting their pictures of it on like Instagram and social media, because it feels like a real book now.
You're a reader, and you do take readings, and people can book you at your website, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so that is www.matauryntarot.com, and I will put that website in the show notes. You also have a ton of events coming up. Like, your year is packed, basically. So I'm going to put a few in the show notes as well that are coming up. And these are all over the country. We have a big one coming up in Austin, Texas on March 7th. You're the keynote speaker at Austin Witch Fest 2020, which is super exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's such a huge honor.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. And you're going to be in San Jose. You're going to be in Maryland, Burns, Tennessee, New Hampshire. So
everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere. So people should probably just follow you or look at the website if they want to see where else you're going, because there's a lot more and dates and locations than this. But also Witches Fest USA, which is in New York, New York. That's on July 10th. I'm very excited. I will see you there.
Oh, exciting.
And so basically the rest of your events can be found on your Facebook author page, correct?
Yeah. And if it's easier for people, if you just hit events on my website, matauryn.com, it redirects straight to that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Matt. This has been such a beautiful pleasure speaking with you. I've loved having you on.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. Stay mystic, witches.
Be sure to subscribe to Mystic Witch on any of your favorite platforms. And you can show your support by contributing monthly at anchor.fm or on our Patreon page. Follow us on social media to hear exclusive audio clips from our guests at Mystic Witch Podcast.